Hello and welcome. Did you know one of the most priceless gifts that you can give someone today is a story? And it's easier to give than you might think. Today, when we struggle to connect with others or we feel too distracted to sit and read the Bible with our kids, stories are a way to bridge those relationships. Sharing stories used to come easy. On warmer summer nights, we would sit on porches and listen to parents and grandparents tell stories about when they were kids, and would know our family's history and we would know what makes it special. Now, computers and games and Netflix have replaced this vital role in our lives. Our kids don't know where they come from or how those in their past overcame their struggles and difficult situations. Our friend next to us doesn't know that 5 years ago we went through the same thing and we survived the same experience as she's struggling with us right now, and it drew us closer to God. Often we are way too busy nowadays to share stories. However, in their research on resilient children, Dr. Duke and Dr. Frivish shared that those children who were the most resilient were those who knew their family stories. They wrote in their article, "It is this intergenerational self and the personal strength and moral guidance that seem to derive from it that are associated with increased resilience, better adjustment, and improved chances of good clinical and educational outcomes." These children, they knew where they came from, they knew they were a part of a bigger story, and that they belonged, which really helped make them resilient and gave them a good foundation for the future. Now, the Bible shares the same ideas. In Psalm 78, Asaph talks about the importance of sharing our God stories with our children. He says in Psalm 78, verses 4 through 7, "We will not hide them from our children, but tell them to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord in his might, the wonders he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commands." So did you hear that? In those verses, he gave four different reasons for why we should pass our stories on to our children. He says we need to help them put their confidence or their hope in God. We need to help them remember his works. We need to help them follow his commands, and we need to help them follow God. He tells them to share so they would put their trust in God and not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. The same is true of those of our friends and family around us. When we share our God stories, it helps them put their trust in God too. They see how he's shown up in their lives and they feel they can trust him to do the same in theirs. So when we share stories about overcoming a struggle or about something that happened to us as children, then our children feel like, hey, my parents have been there too, or those who came before me in my family have been there too. And so I can make it through this struggle too. Or when your friend is really struggling with something in her life, maybe she's lost a spouse, maybe she's miscarried, maybe there's a financial situation going on or a job loss, and you share with her your God story of how God brought you through that same situation, it really gives her hope for the future and encourages her that if God showed up for you, he can show up for her too. They also help us to not forget the past. When I'm tempted to worry about the future, the best antidote is to remember the past, to remind myself how God has been there in the past for me and I can trust him with the future. One way I do this is to kind of keep a journal of God stories. We have this special little notebook that we keep in our family that whenever a God story happens to someone, and it may be something big, it may just be a small incident or something like that, but I try to remember to write down that story so when there are these difficult times in the future that I can look through that book and remember God showed up for me in the past. For example, there was one day when we were in a small apartment and my two sons, oldest children, were about 1 and 3 years old. So in a tiny cramped apartment with a 1-year-old and 3-year-old boys is not a pleasant place to be. And so I would try to leave the apartment every single day. Well, on this particular day, I had promised them the zoo. And usually I didn't tell them where we were going because inevitably something would happen to ruin the trip. And then they would be so disappointed and throw fits. And so on this particular day, I had made the mistake of telling them we were going to the zoo. And so we were heading there. And as we were driving down the road, there were these giant storm clouds coming in. And they were billowing across the sky here in Oklahoma. And I thought, oh no. It is supposed to rain, and there is no good reason it should not rain because those rain clouds are huge. But in that moment, I decided to not put my trust in what I could see, but put my trust in the God who could control the rain clouds. And I just said a quick prayer to him. I was like, God, I really need it to not rain for a few more hours so I can get these boys to the zoo. Can you please hold back this obviously coming rain for just a few more hours? And so he actually answered that prayer. The rain held off, and since it was kind of overcast, it wasn't too hot at the zoo because Oklahoma summers can be blazing. And we had a great time at the zoo and were able to have a relaxing afternoon instead of having to go back to our apartment and be holed up. And so that's just one of the ways I remember that God came through in something little for me, and he can come through for you too in your stories and the things you're struggling with. Another thing that these God stories do is that they can help us to keep his commands. When we see how God's come through for our friends and family in the past, whenever we remember how he's come through for us in the past, then it gives us a heart that really wants to follow his commands and do what he says. When he says love others, we're more prone to trust him. That when he says love others, if we follow through on that, then good things are going to come, that he's going to bless that obedience. Whenever he says, hey, I need you to share with others, I need you to be generous. In those hard situations where we're tempted to kind of hold things to ourselves and not keep our hands open, we remember, hey, he's come through in the past and I know he'll take care of me in the future. And it gives us hearts that really want to follow his commands. Finally, it just helps us to follow God. Like when we, our children hear, hey, your grandparents have been through things, they've gone down, things have gone up, but we held on to God, we believed that he would see us through, and look where we are now. Then that really helps them to believe that things are going to be better in the future. And so ultimately, when we share these stories with our children and with our friends, then it really does help us all put our confidence in God, to trust him, to follow his commands, and ultimately choose to focus on him and follow him even in those hard times. So today I want you to think of something. I want you to consider sharing a God story with those around you. It could be something as big as your conversion story and how you came to know God. It could be something as small as just an incident, like I just shared, that just happened in the afternoon, and you saw that God saw you and he showed up, even when he could have chosen not to. It could have rained that day. But whether it's a big incident or a small incident, I want you to think of one today that you could share with someone else, that you could share with your friend that's maybe struggling through something and you've been afraid to speak up. Or maybe you could share with your children as they come home from school today. One thing that I hear a lot of parents and grandparents say is, I just don't have time to sit down and read the Bible with my children. And that may be true. Between practices, running here and there and all over the place, you may not have a whole lot of time to sit down for even 15 or 20 minutes to read the Bible with your children. It's important, but that may not be where you are right now. However, we all do spend some sort of time with our children, whether you're a parent or a grandparent. You have those times when you're riding in the car, whenever you might be sitting at the table for a second, whenever you might be grabbing a bite to eat at a restaurant, that you could say, hey, I remember when this happened. And so just start thinking of those stories that you could be telling them. I also often hear even grandparents say, hey, I really wish my son or daughter-in-law would talk more to my children about God. And so maybe that's not something you can control, but you yourself can choose to tell them your stories and tell them your God stories. It doesn't even have to be a God story necessarily. Tell them of those times when you grew up and how it was like when you were a child. Because telling those stories over and over and over again makes your children and grandchildren more resilient and will help them through the harder things in life when they see themselves as something bigger. And it will also help them connect to God, just hearing your stories about how he showed up. Same thing with your friends. Maybe you don't have time to really have a Bible study with your friend once a week or something like that. But all of us have a little bit of time to text our friend or something like that, or to maybe call her up real quick when we're on our way to somewhere, or even say, hey, can you meet me for coffee one Saturday morning this month? And then sit there and just share stories with each other. Look across the table if you know she's going through something you're going through, and grab her hand and say, hey, I've been there too, and let me tell you how God has seen me through it. Because those stories make all the difference. So that's your challenge this week. Think of one story you could tell someone and then take time to share it with them this week. And I'll see you back here next time.